Today we'll look at one of the most important essays in analytic philosophy. On first viewing, it can look rather perplexing why this essay should have any wider import outside of looking at some really bizarre logical puzzles or puzzles about language. As a matter of fact, it has immense importance for the developing nature of philosophy in the 20th century. The first thing to point out is that Russell, being a contemporary of More and growing up in the same philosophical soil, is following in More's footsteps with the idea that philosophy's primary job, what it can contribute to the intellectual world, is an analysis of the propositions involved in various claims. Once we come to understand the logical form of the claims we make, then we'll come to better understand what exactly those claims mean, what exactly is entailed by those claims, the exact nature of the picture of reality that we actually get out of those claims. So in this essay, you'll see Russell distinguishing between the logical form of language and the grammatical form of language. The surface grammar of language is going to be different than its underlying logical form, and the logical form is the key to understanding exactly what's going on with those propositions from a philosophical perspective. Russell's idea about the hidden logical form of our propositions leads him to deep thoughts about the nature of the connection between language and world, how the things we say and the words that we think actually hook us up with reality. All of this amounts to a view of philosophy on which philosophy of language is first philosophy. There's an ancient tradition of elevating some specific discipline within philosophy to first philosophy, that is, the philosophy that asks the very most fundamental questions. In Aristotle, we see metaphysics as first philosophy. That assumption is problematized moving into the modern world with Descartes, where often it's thought that epistemology takes over. As a matter of fact, that story is too simplistic. Really, the ancients had a very interconnected and systematic understanding of how the different disciplines of philosophy fit together, but nonetheless, that's the story. And now, with the rejection of certain of the tropes of Descartes, the analytic philosophers move into a new realm. Philosophy of language asks the most fundamental questions that we can ask, and then it's philosophy of language that decodes the nature of reality. Russell and company recovering ontology from Kant's idea, we can't actually really know anything about being. What's required to know about being and existence is to understand exactly how our language works and what kind of beings we are entitled and obligated to talk about with the logical form of our language. In the background of Russell's discussion here is the Brentano school in Vienna, which was another late 1800s school of philosophy coming up around the same time as Russell is thinking about these problems. Brentano had initiated the importance of the notion of intentionality. All of our acts of thought are thought about something. So the arrow here is the arrow of intentionality, that aboutness or directedness of the mind towards its objects. Now, ever since Descartes, there's been the question of modern epistemology. How can we get from a space of interiority in the mind, where we know things are happening, that is beyond doubt. The question is, how do we break out from the mind to the world? How do we understand what the relation is between mind and world? Brentano initiates the new way of thinking about this problem in terms of the notion of intentionality or the directedness of the mind towards its objects. The mind is essentially directed. It's not as though we have some mental states and then later on we add the pointing to the outside world. Rather, the mind in a sense just is the pointing. That's the problem of intentionality. So how does this arrow of intentionality work? A particularly puzzling problem that Brentano's breakthrough to intentionality throws us into is, well, our mind can direct itself onto things that don't exist. Mythological creatures, impossible geometrical objects like round squares. But if our mind, in a sense, just is this directing us towards things, then what happens when the mind directs us towards nothing at all, towards non-existence? Meinong, a student of Brentano, had a very distinctive solution to this problem that initially Russell bought into. That's the idea that suppose we're thinking about Pegasus, our mind is directing us on Pegasus. Now, there is no such thing as a winged horse like Pegasus. So what is it that we're actually thinking about? Thinking about Pegasus is different than thinking about Harry Potter. So it's not as though our mind is simply directing us onto some nebulous nothingness. Meinong quite famously provides a purely ontological solution to the problem. That is, he draws a distinction between being and existence. Being is a more general notion than existence. Anything that the mind can possibly talk about, possibly think about, possibly conjure up, anything at all that you can be directed onto has being. So under being, we have things like mythical creatures, fictional characters, even logically contradictory objects like the round square. All of these have being to the extent that we can direct our minds towards them. Now, they don't have existence. Existence has a much stronger criterion. You actually have to have spatiotemporal properties to take up some slice of space-time in our existing world and so on. So the things that we consider to be real, to be existent, are existing, but anything at all, even unreal things, have being. So that's a purely ontological solution to the problem. Russell initially takes this on, but then becomes extremely unsatisfied with it. He says it's ultimately a contradictory view that can't be maintained with any kind of consistency. Meinong's ontology is often called Meinong's jungle because it's like a jungle that's overpopulated with beings competing for resources and so on. Russell begins the movement to take away anything from your ontology that need not be there. So to cut down on this excess, that's going to be a movement that tracks through analytic philosophy by and large into Quine later on in the 20th century, who expresses the preference for deserts in ontology rather than jungles. That is to say, ontologies that are as sparse as we can make them and still get away with having a theory that makes all the right theoretical moves. On Russell's diagnosis, Meinong had been led astray by the structure of language. Meinong thought that anything that can be turned into a noun, Pegasus or a round square, must refer to some being. That's why Russell begins his article with a discussion of denoting phrases. He says, the difficulties concerning denoting, I believe, are all the result of a wrong analysis of propositions whose verbal expressions contain denoting phrases. So in other words, denoting phrases are terms in the language that seem to stand for things or objects. Words like Pegasus, round square, boat, tree, a man, the King of England. All of these are denoting phrases because they seem to pick out some individual thing. Now, if all denoting phrases do in fact pick out individual things, then we're in Meinong's jungle because they must refer to some being. But Russell is saying they don't. Denoting phrases play a misleading role if you only look at the surface grammar of things. He says this is the principle of the theory of denoting I wish to advocate, that denoting phrases never have any meaning in themselves, but that every proposition in whose verbal expression they occur has a meaning. The problem comes when we take denoting phrases in isolation and think each denoting phrase must stand for a being. Denoting phrases can only be made intelligible in the context of a proposition. This is his Kantianism, his Phrygianism, the idea that the unit of intelligibility is the proposition as a whole. Words by themselves don't necessarily have a determinate meaning until you put them into a whole proposition. That's going to lead us to a theory on which we don't have to countenance the Meinongian jungle. The core of Russell's analysis consists in his treatment of what's known as the paradox of negative existentials. A negative existential is simply a statement that says something or other does not exist. Here's a few examples. There are no flying horses. The Holy Grail doesn't exist. And Thor doesn't exist. Now, these all have their slight differences, but the point of each one is that it's saying of something that it does not exist. On a traditional analysis of the logical form of these statements, what we have is a subject, Thor, for example, and a predicate exists. Now, the subject in this case, you should notice, is exactly what Russell calls a denoting phrase. So if you thought that all denoting phrases stood for a being, the puzzle comes about when you say, this being that I'm referring to, oh, there isn't one, right? So if you think that existence is a predicate, and if you think that what's happening in number 3 is that we're applying or saying that a predicate does not apply to a subject, you come up with a puzzle. According to that puzzle, number 3 cannot be true. In order for a subject-predicate statement to be true, it has to be such that the thing referred to in the subject phrase has or doesn't have the predicate in the predicate phrase. For example, if I say the pen is white, well, that proposition is only true if indeed the subject, the pen, has the property whiteness that I'm predicating of it. If that's what's going on here, then 3 is true if and only if I'm referring to something with the word Thor, and it's true that Thor has the property of not existing. But that can't be right, because nothing that I can refer to as the property of not existing, if I can refer to it, it has to exist in some sense. Therefore, there can't be any true negative existentials. Number 3, indeed number 1 and 2, on this account, can't be true. In other words, there are no true negative existentials. But the conclusion of that argument self-refutes. The conclusion is a negative existential. So we've wound up in a paradox. Now, as we mentioned prior, Russell's initial solution to this is to deny the idea that nothing can have the property of not existing. We have being, which is a much more general property, and existence is only a property that a certain subset of things within being has. But being reaches out into non-existent things as well. So I can still refer to those non-existing beings. They're just in some outer realm of being. No, Russell says, none of that. It's not going to work anymore. Meinong's solution to this has to be thrown out. The real problem here, says Russell, is that this subject-predicate analysis of the logical form of propositions is just not true. We have to investigate what the real logical form of these propositions is.